Hello, everyone. A warm virtual welcome to you. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States Berlin office, I'd like to welcome you to our third online Transatlantic Tuesday. This Transatlantic Tuesday will focus on Trump's migration politics, and I'm very happy that my colleague, Astrid Ziebarth, will be moderating this session. Before I pass the mic to her, I just want to go over a few sort of housekeeping rules before we get started off with our discussion. First off, if you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, please use the raise my hand icon. Your question will automatically be queued up and Astrid will pick your questions. Please make note that this session is being recorded, so you before we unmute you and you're able to deliver your questions. Also, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for helping us support this event. Our current members are Pfizer, Google, Deloitte, and Bayer, and we'd like to thank them for supporting our transatlantic programming. And I'd also like to thank our speakers today, who Astrid, who it will introduce. She is our Senior Migration Fellow in the Berlin office and also Head of Strategy of GMF's Europe program. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I will see you a little bit later. Astrid, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Suda, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this Transatlantic Tuesdays edition on migration. I'm very happy to be part of this series. And yeah, I work as a Senior Migration Fellow in the Europe program, as Suda mentioned. And of course, migration and asylum continue to be hot button issues both in Europe and the United States. Today, we want to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on migration and migration policies in the United States, but also on the coordination with Mexico and at the U.S.-Mexican border. I'm happy to be joined by two great speakers. I hope you can also see them right now. We have Karen Tumlin. She is the founder and director of the Justice Action Center. And it's a fairly new nonprofit organization, and they're fighting for greater justice for immigrant communities. And you use litigation and storytelling, and I'm sure you can tell us all about it later on. And in your Twitter handle, you also say that you have sued every president since number 43. So we'll hear how you're suing the current ones. I don't know. And also on is with us Julián, Escutia Rodríguez. I know that you actually made it to the office today just for us and for the recording. Thank you so much, Julián, for being on. You're Director General for Protection of Mexicans Abroad of the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And you're a career diplomat and in charge of consular and legal assistance programs to Mexican nationals worldwide. And this will be important also as we continue with our conversations to keep that mandate in mind for you. But you were also posted in DC before, so you pretty much have a good understanding of U.S.-Mexican relations on migration, I can assume. Okay, well, great for having you two with us today. Before we dive into our conversation, as most of the viewers probably know, Trump in the past has taken or attempted to try various measures on migration and asylum, from banning immigration from certain countries. He's drastically reduced resettlement places for recognized refugees. He had the zero tolerance policies, which led to separation of families at the borders. Last January, he established what some call a game changer in the policy, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, and that's called MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol, or also better known as the Remain in Mexico policy. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, but basically it requires asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for their days in US immigration court. Now with COVID-19, we see several measures geared towards migration and asylum. On March 20th, there was a CDC, a Center for Disease Control, a health protocol to speed up deportations. And we also had an executive order now in April, which temporarily suspends immigration into the US. And this is also where we want to start the conversation today. But before we start, of course, the tricky part with migration and mobility in times of a pandemic is that because travel might spread disease, no matter where you are, whether you're a migrant or asylum seeker. Of course, the mobility issue is not an easy one to discuss. On the other hand, states want to or might not want to continue to offer protection, even in times of pandemics. So now to the first round, let's call it that way, on the latest executive order. Karen, I would like to start with you. So Trump signed the executive order April 22nd, and he said it was not out of protection for public health, but rather as a response to the economic crisis and to give priority to unemployed Americans. So about 33 million are unemployed. Now, what to make of that last executive order? I mean, at first sight, it seems relatable in a way. You want to protect those who are unemployed. The order is only for 60 days. And we also see exemptions to the rules. So do you take an issue with the executive order, or many? I don't know. And what are they?
Yeah, thanks so much, Astrid, and thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Julián today. So the April 22nd executive order, we do think is really troubling, not because steps could be taken to ensure public health for COVID, but precisely because that's not what the order does. So the order, as you noted, does not say, oh, we're concerned about transmission of the virus. We're going to take certain steps across our entry and exit system to protect folks on all sides. Instead, and the reason it doesn't do that is you would then have to be consistent, right? You would have to apply that in some consistent way, whether it's implementing quarantine or testing or you name it. Instead, the order says we're going to ban family-based and employment-based and diversity visas in order to protect native US-born workers during the economic recovery. I have two issues with that. We are not yet in the economic recovery, issue number one. Issue number two, all of our economic evidence shows that the particular immigrants who have been barred, which I need to be clear, this executive order only bars what we call green card holders, individuals who have qualified for lawful permanent residence in the United States. It's not unauthorized immigrants, it's not temporary workers. It is the most challenging to acquire part of the US system, requiring the most steps. It's also therefore our most high-skilled labor. Mm-hmm. So those are my issues with the program. I'll say really briefly, Astrid mentioned it's only in place for 60 days. It is very understandable to stop many things for 60 days because of the pandemic that we're facing, because you can't have the same level of consular activity, for example. So this is my issue with the present executive order. In that 60 days, there are migrants who've gone through sometimes 10 or 20 years of process to finally get their admission to the US, who will be barred for the rest of their lives. It is those folks that I am concerned with. For example, in our system, if you are the child of a green card holder, a lawful permanent resident, you wait in line and you can ultimately get a visa. We are in touch with an individual, and there's many others like this, who's 20, will turn 21 in June, has been waiting well over a decade for that green card. But if they can't get it during this pause, they lose their eligibility and have to go to a new line where they will wait 76 years. A 21-year-old being asked to wait 76 years is assuring that that individual can't come in. So but that's my issue.
So it's mostly, you're saying, geared towards suspending, for better or worse, family migration or family-sponsored green cards, because there are certain exemptions to this rule. But of course, it goes to the cornerstone of U.S. immigration policy. Now, how have the Democrats reacted to this? Was there an outcry? Has Biden mentioned it, or are they rather not touching migration at the moment?
It's interesting, a little bit of both. So Biden, on the day that the president signed the executive order, did in fact issue a statement. But his statement was, this is President Trump once again using his xenophobic anti-immigrant policy, pushing that and trying to distract from his inadequate response to the pandemic. And that's really all that what you've heard. So certainly Democrats, including presidential candidate Biden, is saying, we don't like this executive order, and it's an attempt to change the public narrative and get away from mismanagement of the US response to the pandemic.
But would you say in general that the Democrats are building a good case now, also a pro-immigration narrative, as we're of course also in an election year? Or is it a topic not to mention?
That is a great question. I would say no. From my perspective, that we have a real imbalance. The President Trump has continued to make immigration and migration his #1 issue, domestically and in the campaign, and Democrats aren't matching that. So they respond to his policies, but they're not saying, no, this is our proactive vision of what immigration means to the United States and why we value it.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen, for that assessment. Julián, I want to turn to you now, to this on this executive order. As we just learned, there are also exemptions to it, mostly also those who are waiting or green card applicants who are inside the United States already, also healthcare workers who are waiting on their green card applications. And of course, a critical infrastructure or segment is also that of agricultural workers. At least it's also a large discussion here in Europe, how to proceed on migration in terms of seasonal workers. Under this executive order, what is the current situation? Are seasonal workers, agricultural workers getting into the United States? Are they also barred? And have you seen any recent changes in the flow of agricultural workers? Yeah, that would be great to know.
Thank you, Astrid, and thanks very much to the German Marshall Fund for the kind invitation. There are a number of challenges right now at the border, and one of them is crossing actually the border. There's an executive action that just allows for necessary crossings to be allowed. So one of them is the group of H2A workers. H2A is a program, it's a visa, temporary agricultural visa for our international audience that allows agricultural workers to travel to the US and work there for a period of time. The agency in charge of this in the US is USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and they have made some changes to their policy in order to allow for these workers to remain in the US or travel to the US. The US consulates in Mexico are closed. Our own offices for passports are closed only for emergencies. So in case there's a group, and there have been some groups of Mexican workers that are traveling with this kind of visa, we are opening the offices for them. So there have been a lot of changes. The flow is not as fluid as it used to be, but they are essential workers for the US economy. They are the ones that are putting food in the tables of the Americans all across the nation. So they are very essential. And we are working closely with the US government to help this flow to continue.
But are there any programs, also health outreach on the Mexican embassies in the United States for Mexican workers, regular or maybe even irregular workers?
Yes, of course. We have 50 consulates in the US and obviously the embassy in Washington, D.C. And we have a permanent outreach program for agricultural workers, no matter what the immigration status they have. We have a health outreach program that is now virtual because most of our offices are closed or limited in the capacity because of the stay-home orders in the states and different cities. But it's a permanent effort to send out information about their rights, no matter their immigration status, and the options they have in terms of employment, labor rights, housing, food, sanitary access to water, soap, and so on.
Okay.
So each consulate has a guide that allows our workers to navigate the system right now in the US, in each city, through the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I mean, as we all know, in the pandemics, in times of pandemics, information campaigns or providing information is also almost as important as providing health, or it's almost the equivalent to that. Karen, I wanted now, because we said that we will have a little bit of a 20 minutes as the Q&A or in the beginnings before we turn it to the audience. But of course, if anyone already has a question, you can, as Sudha mentioned in the beginning, can already raise your hand virtually, and we'll see you later on and take, if it's to any of these related matters, so that we know that you have questions on this. So I wanted now to, in the second half of our conversation, turn to the actual situation at the border, and now how COVID-19 is impacting that. So could you let us know, I mean, you're also, immigration lawyer, and you worked also with clients also in Mexico, as I understand correctly, or have ties. What do you see are the biggest challenges right now at the southern border in times of COVID-19? I mentioned the CDC protocol, the health protocol that is in place at least until May 20th, also quick deportations. Anything that we have seen as new policies because of the pandemics, or is it old policies sped up?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, Astrid. Certainly, as you mentioned in the beginning, the Trump administration has taken a very radical approach to asylum seekers at the southern border. And that really was epitomized in what they called, they don't call it the Remain in Mexico program, that's the colloquial term. They call it the Mexican Migrant Protection Protocol. But that policy basically put a barrier at the southern border. And although US law and international law that the United States has adopted requires the United States to allow in individuals who are claiming asylum and say they are fleeing persecution in order to allow them adjudication of that process. The Trump administration said, no, we're doing it differently. You'll come across the border, we'll log you into the system, we will force you back into Mexico, where you will have to wait for months for your hearing. That has produced camp-like settings in certain border cities along the U.S.-Mexico border, which in my own experience with my clients has put them at risk of sexual and physical assault and kidnappings. The new policy is, there's two new policies. Number one, those proceedings in Remain in Mexico are totally halted. You may have been waiting for 2 months to finally get your hearing date. They are completely closed. They're closed now until at least June, forcing more people in that queue. Secondly, if you're a new arrival,
you mean
Central America.
You mean that they are waiting for their court hearing or their court date that is currently halted. So if they had a hearing before a date that was set, they don't have access to it at the moment.
That's correct, and it's causing some chaos because it's not an orderly system, and people are so terrified. They show up, it's 4 a.m. Often you have to show up on the bridge, the U.S.-Mexico bridges, and report, and they're trying to say, please don't hold it against me. Do I have a hearing today or not? Because they haven't been notified of the closure. But the new policy is a prohibition, and it is the basis, they say, is to protect and limit the spread of the virus. Anyone arriving new doesn't even get logged in the system. They're immediately expelled back into Mexico, and the US will not log them in. So it's a very aggressive change, and there's a lot of questions about the legality of that policy and whether it will be challenged in court.
So will you challenge it or sue? As I mentioned in your Twitter handle, you're avid suer in that sense.
I am in lots of discussions with others. I think we try to do something. We're very, I think everyone can relate to this, limited in our resources. And sometimes if one of our sister organizations is ready to take that on, we try to high five each other and make sure that we're meeting all the unmet needs. Okay. So I do think a suit shall be coming quickly.
Thank you very much, Karen, for briefly explaining what is currently happening at the border. And for those who haven't listened to the Pulitzer Prize Award, the audio, we see the reporting on the Remain in Mexico policy got the Pulitzer Prize for the audio just now this year. So Julián, staying at the border, so we hear about the many people that are being sent back. The policy was established in 2019. More than 60,000 people have been returned since it began. What's the Mexican government's stance on this? Are you okay with it? I mean, there are, as Karen mentioned, there are these camps at the borders, and yeah. So just wanted to hear the Mexican government's stance.
Sure. The approach of the Mexican government has been consistent and very clear since the beginning. It's a humanitarian approach to this issue. We have been receiving all of these migrants with open arms in all of the border cities. There are challenges, of course, in all of these cities. There are not new challenges. They have been there for many, many years. Whenever it started the migration of Mexicans to the US, now we have a different scenario. There was in 2012, 2014, the issue of unaccompanied children fleeing Central America. So there are different dynamics at the border right now, different challenges, but the difference, and it's a very important thing that I would like to stress, Mexico is an open country for migrants. In this pandemic, many different countries have even closed their borders to their nationals. And we have repatriated over 11,000 Mexicans from all over the world, and I have spearheaded that effort. We have brought people from Madagascar, from Sri Lanka, from Russia, Peru, Argentina, from all the corners of the world. And Mexico and the government of Mexico is open to all Mexicans and to other nationals. We have also taken people from cruise ships that no other countries are allowing them to disembark. So the same is happening at the border. We have been receiving Central Americans for almost a year and a half. TRACK is a project of the Syracuse University, has just published last week a very interesting paper with statistics about the MPP. So over 64,000 hearings have been held, 32,000 orders of removal have been issued, and 517 people have received some kind of relief in this program. But our approach, as I said, is humanitarian. We have set up shelters along the border. We have sent labor officers to offer jobs, health officers. So we have done all that we can to help all of these migrants because Mexico is an open country. Thanks.
Thank you. And I mean, of course, I could ask some more questions because other governments in Latin America, and also, we hear about Guatemala. It's of course always you're in negotiations. You not specifically that, but on how to treat migrants' rights versus how to also deal or negotiate with the United States at the same time. So I can imagine it's not an easy task, and we'll probably have more questions on this also as we progress. But maybe just last question, and then we open it up for questions. And a quick reminder, if you want to pose a question, please use the raise hand button. We will then unmute you and you will actually introduce yourself and speak. So different to other webinars. But Julián, may I ask you, how is Mexico itself handling the pandemic and migration, either on your southern borders, or generally?
So as I said, we are an open country for migration. For migrants coming through Mexico, we are releasing most of them because of the conditions of health conditions in order to avoid more contagion. We are working with our Central American partners to repatriate migrants. that flow has restarted after some of them closed their borders, as I said, to their own nationals. So that approach is still the same, humanitarian, trying not to overcrowd migration stations and let people go back to their countries. Also working with consulates and embassies of their own here in Mexico. They are very active and very responsible actors. In terms of our approach to migrants in the US, we are working closely also with NGOs and DHS and other government offices to make sure that Mexican nationals have access to health services, either in detention or if they're in the communities. So it's a huge challenge. New York is a terrible tragedy. Over 500 Mexicans have died in New York due to COVID-19. So we are working closely with the families to make sure that they have support and their remains can come back to Mexico. So it's a very complex situation for migrants all across the globe, and we are certainly doing our best to help Mexican migrants and migrants that come through Mexico.
Okay. Thank you very much for explaining that a bit more, and I'm sure we'll get also some other questions. Now, I have a first hand that I see, and I will unmute, and it's Jim Colby. So I'll unmute you at this moment. And if you could briefly introduce yourself and pose your question, and you should be unmuted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Astrid, for the, can you hear me? It says
Yes.
I'm muted, yeah. Thank you very much and for hosting this and for our speakers there. I guess this question is for Julián. You mentioned, talking about the agricultural workers that are coming into the United States, you mentioned, of course, that the Mexican passport offices are closed except for emergency purposes, and of course the American consulates are closed. So would it be accurate to say the only ones that are getting in or coming in are those pre-existing that already have their visas and passports? So new prospects of workers, agricultural workers, are not getting into the country at this time. Is that correct?
So
yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for your question. So USCIS announced a series of policy decisions that make it easier for H2 workers to travel to the US. One is automatic renovation. Two is if they are already in the US, it is prorated or extended. So there are a couple of decisions that they took that make it easier, but brand new applications are not being processed right now.
Thank you, Julián, for the answer. And Jim Colby, just for full disclosure, also has, of course, ample experience in the state of Arizona, so maybe we'll hear more about that. Next, I have a question. I'll do it's called Allowed to Talk, but Johannes Braak, if you could briefly introduce yourself to the speakers and then pose your question.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Also, buenas tardes to Mexico. My name is Johannes Braak. I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the Hertie School in Berlin. And I lived a youth exchange with Rotary in Tijuana some years ago. And my question is for Julián, how you or the Mexican government wants or is helping Mexicans who now cannot travel to the United States for delivering their labor, for working on the other side of the border. How do you want to help, or how is the Mexican government helping these citizens? Thank you.
Johannes, just to make sure I fully understand, so I mean, you're asking about any type of labor migration at the moment from Mexico to the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, in Tijuana, just to clarify it, a lot of people go to work legally, also to do shopping, what they cannot do, maybe for their business in Mexico. But on the other hand, I mean, they work and go back to Tijuana. So yeah, that's just a clarification.
Okay, so you mean border crossings, border towns where it's
Yes.
quite normal usually to transfer, like we have also between Germany and France or other country, border towns where the same question applies. So Julián, if you could tell us a little bit about that, how are border towns at the moment actually faring? And maybe Karen, if you have some experiences or first-hand accounts on that as well, that would be quite great to hear.
Thanks, Johannes, for your question. There are two kind of not maybe conflicting or contradictory dynamics going on right now. So the message for the population in Mexico is to stay home. That's the way we will try to stop this pandemic, and that's the call of the government and of society to everybody. Then at the same time, in the border, people, as you say, cross all the time. And there's an executive action by the US government that limits crossings to essential activities. How do you interpret that is complicated, but students, health workers, H2A workers are crossing the border. A lot of people are crossing the border right now. So basically tourism and shopping is the crossers that are not doing it so much and that are actually prohibited right now. But overall, the number of crossings are down dramatically due to the message that we should stay home to stop this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Karen, anything to add from your end, or?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add from my end is, and agree with everything that Julián has said. Those of us who are lawyers, nonprofit workers who work across the border, the challenge has been for us. So yes, we could cross, right? We can cross. It's considered essential to provide those services. Since the courts have been closed, however, most of the organizations are taking to heart, right, our own stay-at-home orders and not crossing. The population that is being impacted by this is the individuals that I was talking about who've been waiting, including in Tijuana, for months for their hearings, and they have very good reason to believe that they don't report on the bridge that day, even though court is closed, that there will be adverse consequences to them. So some limited amount of attorneys are still showing up at the bridges to assist those individuals because of the massive language barriers that exist and the inability to navigate that system on the bridge, often in the dark, with a Border Patrol officer alone. So that's kind of the trickiest place that I have seen. And of course, the people who are doing that are taking risks by going out every morning to the bridge to try to assist these asylum seekers.
Thank you very much. I have another question. It was more posted to the chat, but I'll see if Delancey, Gustin, if you're still there and want to raise your hand. Don't know. Yes, you are. So I'll allow you to talk. If you want to briefly introduce yourself and pose your question.
Hi, this is Delancey Gustin. I work as a statistician for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and I'm just was curious to hear from Julián a little bit more. You mentioned a little bit about the southern border and that you're, still facilitating migration or allowing migration to some extent. But I just was wondering if you could speak to what you guys are seeing in terms of the flows of migrants from, in particular, the Northern Triangle countries since the beginning of this pandemic. So have you seen a reduction in numbers, and to what extent? And are you seeing any other kinds of interesting changes in the demographics, for instance, of the people who are still coming?
Okay, thank you for a question from a statistician. Of course, a question on statistics. Julián, I don't know how much you now are breathing the statistics for Mexico on that, but yeah, what are some of the features that you might know about?
No, definitely. We have seen a dramatic drop in the number of migrants coming from Central America and other regions through Mexico trying to reach the U.S.-Mexico border. The number of Mexicans also trying to cross the border without documents has also fallen sharply. I think some days the number of apprehensions are below 1,000, even 500. So I think that the message across the globe and certainly in Latin America, Central America, and Mexico about staying home is really sticking. That's good for public health. I don't know what would happen or what will happen next when countries start opening up and cities are relaxing some restrictions. But right now, I can certainly say that the number of migrants coming through Mexico and trying to reach the border and crossing the border to the US has dropped dramatically.
But are you anticipating, I mean, I don't know if you as in the government entity have any forecasting methods, but are you anticipating that this might take up again in the next couple of months? Or do you think because there have been such strict limitations that this number will remain to be a little bit low or will be on the lower end?
Well, certainly the US policies put some restriction on the odds and possibilities of reaching the border and getting some immigration relief. That is always in the mind of some migrants. Some people will try to cross the border, that's for sure. So we don't really have a forecast. It's really difficult to tell. Some people are also talking about repatriation or voluntary, let's say, repatriation, people that are losing their jobs or have lost their jobs, and they would try to wait for a recovery in their home countries. So maybe we'll see a reverse migration. We don't know.
And also, I mean, I think, and it's another question that we talked about beforehand, it was interesting from you to learn that actually, I mean, for those Mexicans who are in the United States, as we know, a lot of support is also done through remittances. So the money that migrants send home, and usually, or what we see globally, that there's a drop in the remittances, but not so far, as I understand, from the United States to Mexico. How do you explain that?
Yeah, so March was a very unusual month for remittances from the US to Mexico. It was actually a record amount of remittances sent. So there are a number of theories behind that. One is that they are sending their savings back home and then they will return. Another one is that it was like the last payment they got and they're trying to help their families to cope with the pandemic here. So it's not for sure yet if this trend will maintain. I believe, and many academics and others think that remittances will actually drop very rapidly in the coming months. But also, whenever the recovery starts, migrant workers will be very demanded. And I think that also remittances will recover. So we will see.
Thank you. And I mean, Karen, I want to come back to you and slightly more also into the policy wonky discussions. But I mean, as we now think about COVID-19, the impact on migration and migration policy, here in Europe, we're seeing that in the beginning, it's in the first, when it first started, we seemed, there are, of course, also a lot of migrant workers in very critical industries like healthcare, agriculture, the meat processing. At the same time, when it comes to humanitarian migration, there seems to be a reluctance or a challenge, of course, also because of not being able to travel to do that. Do you see that this will also happen in the long run and might also have long-lasting impacts in the United States as well?
Yeah, certainly the same is true in the United States in terms of our immigrant workforce is, all across, making up not only large numbers, but in some sectors, disproportionate numbers of our essential workforce. So that is true, for example, in our medical professions. So both doctors and nurses, foreign-born workers are disproportionately represented. It's also true in our delivery services, in our agricultural workers, in our home health care and childcare workers. And so what we are seeing is, on one hand, immigrant workers are disproportionately at risk because they continue in the essential workforce. As you said, Astrid, obviously we're concerned what will happen if the current pauses on inflows of migration continue. Will we not have the workers that we need to meet these critical infrastructure needs? And then you didn't quite talk about this, Astrid, but one of the issues that we have is we have differential access to our social safety net and protections, whether you're a U.S. citizen or what your immigration status is. And that, of course, is also impacting both immigrants in the essential workforce, but also immigrants who are suffering job losses due to the economic downturn. So we have a lot to figure out as this goes on.
And I mean, just a quick reminder to everyone: if you don't feel like you want to expose yourself with a question with the audio, you can of course also type it into the Q&A. Otherwise, just raise your hand. At the moment, I don't see any raised hands. That's why I'm continuing the conversation with Karen and Julián. But as soon as you do step forward, please just put it either in the chat or raise your hand. So Karen, you mentioned that there's an uneven access to the healthcare. And I briefly asked Julián in the beginning about the undocumented. I mean, this is, of course, here sitting in Europe, we always hear about the large number of undocumented or irregulars. How is their access to healthcare currently granted, or what's in place for them?
Sure. At the most general level, undocumented immigrants, of course, have access to emergency services, healthcare services. So no one will be turned away if they are in, obviously dire need of assistance due to COVID complications. But they don't necessarily have health insurance or employer-provided coverage or state-provided coverage. Also, so that's on the healthcare end, and we are seeing that. We've always had issues. It continues within the pandemic, unfortunately, of those who are willing to come forward either to seek care or get tested. The undocumented population will often stay away even when they're sick, which is a huge challenge. Our other challenges in terms of unemployment benefits for workers, undocumented or unauthorized immigrants do not have access to unemployment funds. So they may be suffering the same job loss that a U.S. citizen is suffering, but they cannot tap into short-term funds to carry them through. What we have seen is both states and private philanthropy has set up undocumented unemployment relief funds in certain states in the United States to meet this gap.
Yeah, because it's a no-brainer that you can only, I mean, if you want to beat a pandemic, everyone has to be involved, or you have to reach everyone. But of course, there are a lot of question marks when you're living in an undocumented status. I also heard that if you're in a mixed relationship where someone has a status and the other one doesn't, you wouldn't even benefit maybe from some of the tax cuts or some of the policies that are currently in place. So yeah, something to talk about. We have another question or comment. So I would like to ask Susanne Dieper to briefly introduce herself and ask her question or pose her comment, which you're also more than happy to do. Susanne, I think you, I'm unmuting you now, which is not working. Elisabeth, if you could help me, because my unmuting is not working.
My apologies. I must have pressed something. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
I'm sorry. I don't actually have a question. I must have pushed the raise hand button by mistake. Apologies. I'm listening intently, though. It's very interesting.
No problem. We're always happy to also see and hear who's, of course, on the call to discuss some of our debates now on migration. Karen.
Astrid,
yep.
In terms of access to healthcare, I would like to echo Karen's comments regarding the undocumented. There's an uneven policies in the different states and even cities and counties in the U.S. There are some places where undocumented migrants have access to some kind of insurance that grant them access to different services. Some other parts of the U.S. are more restrictive. Certainly, they have access to emergency services. So what we have is a program, a health outreach program. It's called Ventanillas de Salud. It's almost 20 years old program. It works in every consulate, and we help all of our nationals to navigate the healthcare system in the U.S., which is really complicated, as you may know.
Yes, thank you very much. I do know, and you don't want to get sick in the US, it seems, because it's also the bills are horrendous if you're really not covered. I have also another topic I wanted to talk to you about, and that is that of sanctuary cities. I mean, right now it seems that Trump has always gone after the states, and also, I mean, California, other states, but also cities, and especially. Is there anything to say how they, or how is it currently going on? Do they have targeted them again, the sanctuary cities? And anything you could add or shine a light on that one? Karen, I would, yeah.
So the sanctuary cities issue, and for folks who may not be familiar with the term, that is a reference to cities in the United States who have taken policies to, essentially provide or protect their immigrant communities regardless of status. Oftentimes it's focused on a law enforcement discussion. So for example, that law enforcement has found it absolutely mission critical to ensure that all residents, regardless of status, can report crimes to them, and that they will not make inquiries about immigration status, because that makes certain immigrants less likely to cooperate with law enforcement. And the president has, in fact, sued these cities and tried to cut off federal funds for their law enforcement agencies as a result of these no-ask policies. That is in some major court litigation, which overall has gone against the Trump administration and has allowed these policies to stay in place. What I'm seeing with sanctuary cities right now related to the pandemic is, number one, that they are taking moves to ensure that testing and treatment has the same no-ask policies, that it's very clear that it's regardless of status. And number two, these cities are very much putting their money where their mouth is, right? They're creating funds both for healthcare provision and job loss for their undocumented workers to ensure that both with respect to health, we are all interconnected. And if we're not providing for all, we're all going to suffer longer in this pandemic. And the same is also true, we believe, of our job recovery. If we're not providing for all, that is going to impact us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I have a question, and I don't know, maybe it was also again by accident, not by accident, but Jim Colby, and I'm unmuting you. No, you're unmuted now. And if you wanted to raise your question or maybe also a comment, as I might disclose that you're a former congressman from the Republicans in the state of Arizona. So I'm sure you also have some interesting insights to share.
Well, thank you, Astrid, but I'm hunkered down here in Washington, D.C., so I haven't been in Arizona during this COVID crisis. But something that Karen said, and then Julián touched on it in his response to, that I'd like to ask about, and that goes back to the COVID, the immigrants and COVID, and the very fact that they are in jobs that are considered essential, the very fact that they probably don't have insurance or access to healthcare, the very fact that they are undocumented. Do we have any evidence at all that would tell us whether there's a disproportionate number of these people who have been tested as having COVID, the infection, or have either been hospitalized or have had deaths as a result of that? I suspect I know the answer, that we don't have that documentation anyplace in the country, but I'm just wondering if you have anecdotal evidence that might tell us something about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Karen or Julián, do you have any numbers or estimates?
I mean, I'll tell you what I have looked at, because I've asked that question to myself, Jim, also. I thought, oh my goodness, if immigrants are disproportionately represented in all of these essential services, aren't they disproportionately at risk? Are they disproportionately getting COVID? And there's some estimates put out by the Migration Policy Institute. Now, it doesn't tell us about rate of infection yet, because I don't think we have that information. What it does is it provides the best estimates that I've seen to date of foreign-born workers in these different occupations and industries. I'm certainly curious about that. The one anecdotal piece of information I'll kind of lift up is we have seen, I guess they call it, maybe not epicenters, I'm forgetting the word for the outbreaks, right? Both in the meat processing plants in the United States, where there are large shares of not only foreign-born but undocumented workers. And now also we started to see some of that in our agricultural industry. So it is anecdotal, but at some of those sites you're seeing extraordinarily high infection rates, and of course that they're even, for certain states like Nebraska, driving the largest numbers in that state. That's what I've seen so far, but maybe Julián has seen something else, or maybe we can, maybe our expert statistician Delancey will have other takes on where we should look.
Okay. Julián, anything from your end to add to
Yes.
this?
It's a very important question, and it's one that we ask ourselves every day. If the Mexican or the Latino population are being affected more than other populations, and how to react to that. Certainly, it's complicated because in terms of deaths, we receive reports from families that seek some financial assistance. So the number that we have might be lower than the real one. The no-ask policy also complicates this kind of statistics recollection, but there are some initiatives, like in Chicago, there's like a Latino task force that are working on checking the statistics and creating some policies and programs to help the population. The same in New York. So we don't have precise information given the no-ask policy, and that reports are voluntary on our end.
Okay, thank you. And I actually have one last question here in the chat, and it's maybe a tougher one for you, Julián. It's from Delancey, and she poses the good question. Before it all started to get really more dramatic with COVID, the US already also announced that it would have travel bans with European countries or with Europe. How did the Mexican government, prior to closing the border, communicate? The US government, prior to closing the borders, communicate with the Mexican government on these policies? Was there any forewarning, any coordination? Because yeah, it certainly caught a lot of European policymakers off guard.
I didn't get the question. What is the question?
Oh, I can ask it also. Sorry, I unmuted myself.
Okay, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy again. Yeah, I was just curious. Yeah, because the Europeans were really caught off guard with the travel restrictions when they were imposed on European travel. I was just wondering, when in the run up to the closing of the U.S.-Mexico border to most travel, was there communication and coordination between the U.S. and Mexican governments, or was there a similar situation of the Mexicans being caught off guard? I ask because, not to just know, sort of the gossip of what happened during that time, but rather, to know what we might be able to expect as we start to open up again eventually. Do you anticipate that there will be a lot of coordination and communication between the governments and partnership? Or do you see that it'll be more of a unilateral sort of decision-making process?
Thanks, Delancey. No, we have a very close coordination and communication. The H1N1 pandemic back in 2009, 2010 gave us a kind of a roadmap to deal with these situations, and also there was a previous effort in 2000. So there's a lot of communication, actually, not only with the US, but also with Canada. So there's a North American dialogue going on that is permanent, and the communication is quite fluid. I have to say for our international audience that the border is not closed. It's open for essential travelers, but essential is a wide term. And at the same time, as I previously said, the stay home message is not an order in Mexico, but it's a message. It's being observed very strictly. So the number of people on the streets everywhere in Mexico is really, really low. So the crossings are also low as well, even before the executive order.
Okay, so maybe there will be some more coordination or conversations, as you mentioned, those channels were there before. Well, happy to continue that conversation at some other point. And at this point, I want to close the debate for now and thank the two speakers for sharing their insights. We at GMF also work on migration, also in Europe. And of course, here we are looking into this same policy issues, humanity and how to deal with migration and what are the impacts of COVID on some of the migration policies. We do that through interactive workshops. If you're interested and if you're viewing or listening for the first time and to learn about the migration program at TMF, just contact us. But I'm also happy that my colleagues Suda and Elizabeth invited us to cover the topic of migration in their Transatlantic Tuesdays series. Happy to be back with more. I'm certain that the migration as an election issue might come up again, that we'll see some of these issues that we've talked about now briefly will potentially pick up more steam. So handing it back to Suda and thanking Karen and Julián and all the viewers and the question askers and commenters for their attention. Thank you very much.
Astrid, we have to thank you to have such expert moderation on this topic that's very timely, and also thank our speakers Karen and Julián for taking the time to be with us today, for your candid views and expert opinion as well. And one more time, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for the support, and finally, last but not least, Elizabeth, my colleague, who has been sort of the brain trust of these Transatlantic Tuesdays, for organizing everything. And thanks to all of you. Hope you tune in again next month. Have a great evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.